Hey y'all, thank you for jumping back into this conversation through the book of Colossians with us again. And just so that we're kind of all on the same page, maybe you haven't watched the other videos yet, you should go check those out, because of course this whole thing is going to continue to build on each other. But we want you guys to know, just so a little bit of review, we want you guys to remember that Paul is writing to people that he is calling saints. He was saying that those that follow Jesus in the city of Colossae 2,000 years ago were set apart for the Lord's glory. And he's saying this, that if you are a follower of Jesus, whoever you are, wherever you are in life, and whatever it is that you're doing, you are set apart for God's glory. You are meant on this earth to exemplify Christ. And that's kind of what we saw last week, when we asked the all-important question, what is God's will for my life? And I know at times that can be a really tricky question to answer, and maybe even really challenging, and one that does, though it shouldn't, cause some of us a great deal of anxiety. We shouldn't be asking the question, what is God's will for my life, as if it's hidden or something like that. He says, the will that I have for your life is in whatever it is that you're doing. You are called to glorify me. You're called to show and be my presence on the earth, just like Jesus is. That's what Jesus did when he was on earth. And so that's kind of what we were talking about the last couple of weeks. This week we really get into, though, the kind of nuts and bolts. This is going to be a kind of a deep, these are deep weeds that we get to in Colossians chapter 15. They aren't for the faint of heart, and really when we read them, we have to maybe go back and reread them. So maybe watch this video, maybe watch it slowly, but definitely go back to the scriptures. Go back to Colossians chapter 1. Look at verses 15 through 23. That's what we're gonna look at today and read together and talk through. But maybe you're just gonna have to read it slowly. Maybe you're gonna have to read it over multiple days. You're gonna have to really meditate on what it is that Paul is saying exactly about who Jesus is in this section of Scripture. Remember, the whole argument of Colossians is Jesus is better. Jesus is better, and he is greater than anything else that we could embrace. He is greater than anything that we could gain on this earth in our lives. Jesus is the very best for us. And Paul is going to begin to make that argument, and he's going to show us how that plays out in our everyday lives. So let's read Colossians chapter 1, starting in verse 15. It says this: He, that is Jesus, is the image of the invisible God. He is the firstborn of all creation, for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, whether they're visible or invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Verse 18, and he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. Verse 21, and you, who were once alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister. So the question we see in this passage is, who is Jesus, and what exactly did Jesus do? This may be a more important question than the one we asked last week. What is God's will for my life? Well, it doesn't really matter if we don't exactly know who Jesus is and what it is that Jesus did for us. And so Paul is making the argument that Jesus is greater. How does he make that argument? He says in verse 16, "For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible." So Jesus is greater. Jesus is greatest because he is the one that created all things. He is the reason that all things were created. So he is responsible, Jesus is responsible for creation, yet at the exact same time, Jesus is the reason for which everything was created. So let me say that one more time. Jesus is responsible for creation, and he is the reason for which all creation exists. So when we go to these amazing places, maybe we just drive out to the Great Smoky Mountain National Park and we take a hike and we're up at the top of a mountain and we're overlooking trees and mountains and valleys and rivers, and we're hearing nature and all of these beautiful things. Or we go out west to the Rocky Mountains and we take a hike and we're standing up at the top of a point of a mountain and we're looking out. We shouldn't be praising creation. We should be praising, and we should be humbled, and we should be moved to love more deeply and submit our whole lives to the one that actually created all of these things. This is Jesus. So Jesus is the one responsible for creating beauty. Why? Because he's beautiful. And Jesus is the one for creating these powerful things that we see. Maybe it's like we're sitting out on the back porch one evening and we're watching a storm and hearing it roll in, and we're kind of blown away by the power just of a storm. It's Jesus that created that storm and created the world in which these storms exist. So whether we look at creation and we see it as beautiful, or whether we look at creation and we see it as all powerful, we look at Jesus and we say he is more beautiful and he is more powerful than any of those things. Why? Because Paul writes here in verses 16 and 17, "For by him all things were created," and at the end of verse 16, "all things were created through him and for him." So creation exists just like us. We are created beings. We exist for him. We exist for Jesus' glory. Look at verse 17 though. He says this, "And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together." So he literally has time in his hands. He has rulers and authorities in his hands. It's Jesus that has set all of this up, and it's Jesus that is the one that is sustaining all things. So this is the Jesus that we continue to place our faith in. We don't just place our faith in Jesus just for the forgiveness of sins, though we do that, so that we can be reconciled to the Father, but we continue to place our faith in Jesus as we look around at the world and all of these crazy things that are going on, and maybe we're just dealing with pain, or maybe we're dealing with anxiety. We run to Jesus and we continue to trust and believe that he is the one that has created everything that's going on around us, and he is the one that is sustaining us through it. This is who Jesus is. So we praise Jesus as creator. Yet Paul goes on and he says that we praise Jesus for being our caretaker. Look at verse 18 with me. Paul writes, "And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent." So just like Jesus created all things, he's the reason for creation. He is glorified through creation, through his church. He is preeminent. Look what he says. He says, Jesus is the head of the body. So remember who's writing this letter. It's Paul. And when we meet Paul, he's actually called Saul in the book of Acts, and when we first meet him, he's breathing out threats against the church. We've kind of covered that in the very first session, but when he's converted, we see this amazing picture of him on this road, and he's persecuting the church, and he's struck down by blindness in this unbelievable light, and God comes to him and he says, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Now the crazy thing is Saul actually isn't doing anything physical to Jesus. Yet, Jesus doesn't distinguish between himself and his church. If you are hurting God's church, then you are literally hurting Jesus. And so he doesn't want us to feel like we're out here on our own. So he says the church, it's literally a body. Remember last week when we looked at Colossians, or the very first week, and we said that we're called brothers and sisters in Christ. We are a family, right? If we're believers and following Jesus, then those that follow Jesus with us are like our brothers and our sisters. Jesus here is saying that I am the head of this body. Just like you all are related, you're related with me and you get to relate to me. So why is it that Jesus is so great? Because he isn't a God that is aloof. Jesus isn't a God that is far off. He is near and dear to his church. We say that Jesus is with us, God with us. And this is what he means. He says, I am with my body. I am with my church. I am with those that love me. And I am leading those that follow me. So Paul's made the argument that Jesus is the best, or Jesus is the greatest because he is creator, he's the reason, and he's the way through which everything came about. Yet he also said that he is the caretaker, he's personal. Though he's powerful and though he's preeminent, though he's greater than anything else, he's also personal with his church, and he's the head of that church. He's leading us as we follow him. Jesus is greatest though for another reason, and it's because he redeemed us. Look with me at verse 22 one more time. Paul writes these words, he has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. So these are deep theological truths, yet at the same time they have real application for how we live our lives. There are three key words that we've looked at: holy, blameless, and faultless. So the scriptures want you to walk through life understanding that you are holy, you are set apart for the Lord's glory, and in whatever you do, just know and acknowledge that you're going to do that for the Lord's glory, and every decision that you have to make, you're going to do it in a way that you can best position yourself to serve him and to demonstrate his love to the world around you. He wants us to understand that we're faultless. We have a new position. We don't have to stand before him as guilty anymore. We are standing before the Lord as his children. And then there's one more: we are blameless. And many of us walk through life kind of with the baggage of past sins, past regrets. Jesus wants us to understand that when we stand before him now and when he looks at us, he doesn't look at all of the sin. He looks at the fact that we have placed our faith in him and we are following him. We are his children. And so let go of some of that baggage. Let go of some of that regret and follow Jesus with everything that we have.